New York's tallest buildings. The World Trade Center collapses with thousands of people trapped inside. Another airliner then flew into the Pentagon. The White House says those who carried out the attacks will be hunted down.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
This is BBC News. I'm Deborah Mackenzie.
And I'm Bill Turnbull. Thousands of people are feared dead after a devastating series of terrorist attacks on the United States of America. At about 9 a.m. local time, hijacked passenger aircraft were flown deliberately into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Within the next 2 hours, the center of Manhattan's business area lay in ruins after the twin towers of the Trade Center, America's two tallest buildings, collapsed. All air traffic in the country was suspended and security forces put onto a state of the highest alert. President Bush, who'd been visiting Florida, was evacuated to a nuclear bunker from where he pledged to hunt down and punish those responsible. The first blow was struck at 8:45 in the morning, New York time. A hijacked airliner carrying dozens of passengers flew straight into the World Trade Center's North Tower with devastating effect. 18 minutes later, a second attack. Another hijacked jet struck the Trade Center's twin South Tower, exploding in a huge fireball. Next, it was the turn of Washington and the Pentagon, the nerve center of America's military. A third hijacked American airliner, again with dozens of passengers on board, deliberately flown into the side of the building. As panic spread on the streets, all civilian flights were grounded. New York's stock exchange was suspended and the White House was evacuated, along with thousands of personnel in other government buildings. Then the unthinkable. The South Tower of the World Trade Center, the world's fourth tallest building, collapsed. Followed minutes later by the center's second tower, the building symbol of global trade and workplace for 50,000 people, reduced to rubble. No one knows how many have died. A fourth hijacked plane crashed later in Pennsylvania. Well, for the latest now, we can go to Washington and join our correspondent, Stephen Speech. Nobody knows, can even begin to estimate the death toll, really, Stephen, but President Bush said it would be in the thousands.
Yes, this was, in a sense, the first official indication that we've had of the magnitude of the loss of life here today. He spoke about thousands of lives being prematurely ended right at the beginning of his address to the nation this evening. And I think, of course, most of those lives will have been lost in New York, both in the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center and from the people who were in the World Trade Center, but also, of course, loss of life here in Washington, at the Pentagon, the people on board that American Airlines jet that crashed into the side of the Pentagon. Some people still trapped in the rubble here, we believe, rescue work carrying on into the night. But people here devastated by the tragedy. Now, there's talk from the politicians here of everything trying to be back to normal in a sense tomorrow with government agencies opening. But of course things are far from normal at the moment. And for this report on the day's events, we now go to my colleague James Robbins.
It should have been a perfect day. But just before 9 o'clock, the pure blue sky over Manhattan was filling with smoke. A hijacked American airliner had just smashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. No one quite knew what had happened. Surely this must have been a terrible accident. But what happened next showed these were no accidents. A second hijacked airliner, a Boeing 767 with 92 people on board, is flying straight for the other tower. No one yet knows who piloted these planes to destruction, but they could not have been targeted with greater accuracy. The extraordinary impact of the second plane, the 767, was witnessed by many who simply didn't realize the full enormity of what was happening. Nor could they know the implications of a huge airliner laden with aviation fuel exploding deep inside one of the world's tallest buildings. They certainly didn't realize the twin towers of the World Trade Center were now completely doomed.
Wow, do you see this aircraft? I've got it all.
By now, many hundreds of people must already have been dead, and the unfolding disaster could be seen all around New York.
Another one. I'm taking a look.
Oh my God! Oh, Jesus! Oh my God!
My own eye. Just went in. Must be a target or something.
Oh my God! Another
plane just went in.
At that time, there would have been about 10,000 people in each tower of the World Trade Center, many thousands more in the Wall Street financial district all around. Those who could were running for their lives.
Let's just...
I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the south tower halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
When a big explosion happened, some guy came out, his skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
But it wasn't only New York and America's financial heart which was under attack. Now it was the nation's capital, too. In Washington, the Pentagon was hit, headquarters for the armed forces of the world's superpower. A third hijacked airliner, again with dozens on board, had been crashed with devastating results. By now, smoke was billowing around Capitol Hill, and the White House was being evacuated. People were talking of a new Pearl Harbor, someone declaring war on the United States. And back in New York, the nightmare was still far from over. Firefighters were in the basement of the World Trade Center, wondering if the building above was safe. The unthinkable was about to happen. The South Tower, all 110 stories, collapsed, and it was all live on American television.
Thanks very much.
Completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly. The second building that we witnessed the airplane enter.
On the ground, emergency services hardly knew which way to turn. People still trapped in the second tower had seen it all and could only wave in desperation. But it was already too late for rescue. The second tower, representing America's trade and wealth, was about to go. The Twin Towers, which took 7 years to build, had been utterly destroyed in a single morning. The Manhattan skyline and countless lives devastated.
Not go down the ground. You will get trapped. You will get trapped. Don't go.
Big boom. Come down the steps. Everything fine till we got to the basement, and then everything just fell in. I got trapped under there with another guy. Crawled out. Kept getting hit in the head. Bounced all around. Finally, we clawed our way out over the rubble.
Yeah.
Come on down. We did all right.
All right, way to be, Tom. Let's go.
Even the bloodied felt incredibly lucky on this terrible day. And firefighters could embrace each other for a few moments before facing many more hours of trauma. As New York struggled to cope, to adapt to the clogging dust, the fallout of so much tragedy, more news was coming in, a fourth crashed airliner in Pittsburgh. And somehow American government seemed almost powerless amidst all this. The centers of that power had been evacuated, key congressional leaders taken to secret locations. The president himself whisked to a nuclear bunker in Nebraska, shaken but pledging somehow to find those who masterminded this day of mayhem and massacre.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Hours after the attacks, the United States, the whole world, is struggling to take it all in. There's really no more rescue the firemen can seriously attempt. It's now a question of salvage amid the wreckage, as others in New York try to establish how many men, women and children have been lost. A priest picks his way through the New York ruins. The World Trade Center has been reduced to the stumps of skyscrapers that once helped define one of the world's most vibrant cities, normally loud with life. An entire society feels itself violated by terror. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, let's go back to Stephen's speech in Washington. And Stephen, normal life in the United States ground to a halt.
To a certain extent. Certainly here in Washington, federal agencies, government buildings were pretty much deserted throughout the afternoon and for most of the morning as well. People were evacuated from there. In fact, here in Washington this evening, the streets have more or less returned to normal. Not, of course, the streets around here, around the White House, but elsewhere in the city. You can see people out enjoying themselves even and having a meal and a drink. But certainly, as far as the government is concerned, things not at all back to normal yet. Only tomorrow, we're told, will the government buildings be reopening for what's called normal business.
The United States, President Bush said, will hunt down those responsible. How do they start to look for them?
Well, this, of course, is a very good point. We have had some indications that the suspicions may already be hardening that Osama bin Laden and his group were responsible for these attacks. Senator Orrin Hatch, a Republican senator, has said that he's heard that the CIA intercepted conversations between bin Laden supporters. Now, we only have that from him so far, but it's an indication that suspicion is hardening that it may have been bin Laden's group.
Many other questions to come, of course, Chris, especially how this could have happened. How could the airport security have been so poor as to allow 4 hijacks in one day? And how is it that American intelligence failed so badly?
Yes, I think that is probably, from the point of view of the immediate situation, that is the big criticism. It seems that the hijacks were carried out with knives. We had a couple of cell phone calls being made by one of the passengers unfortunate enough to have been on one of the aircraft. She made that call to her husband, saying that the attackers were armed with knives, in some cases stabbing flight attendants as they took over the planes, and then, of course, taking over the controls themselves and flying into the various locations. I think that is a big criticism. As far as the fact that the planes were able to fly over New York so low, I mean, I haven't heard quite so much criticism about that. I think the broader criticism is simply that the United States has allowed what are called these terrorist networks to carry on flourishing. We have an article by Henry Kissinger in the Washington Post, which is coming out just about now, saying that it's time to go after the global terrorist networks that threaten the United States. We also have an article by Jim Hoagland, a prominent commentator, saying that there has been a certain complacency in the repeated assurances from officials in both the Clinton and Bush administrations that U.S. power has put its openly declared enemies abroad in a box from which they were powerless to strike convincingly at U.S. interests. In other words, he's more or less saying that the intelligence services haven't done their job, not just in preventing this particular attack, but in dealing with the whole network of organisations and indeed governments which lie behind it.
Chris Veach in Washington, thank you.
This is BBC News now, a summary. President George Bush has acknowledged that thousands of people were killed in the series of attacks in which hijacked airliners were flown deliberately into landmark buildings on Tuesday. Speaking from the White House, President Bush said the victims' lives had been ended by evil. He said world leaders would stand together to win the war against terrorism.
It's a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
He was speaking after consulting his national security advisors about how to respond to the destruction of the World Trade Center in New York and serious damage to the Pentagon in Washington. 2 hijacked passenger planes flew directly into the sides of the twin skyscrapers of the World Trade Center during Tuesday morning's rush hour. Both towers caught fire immediately and later collapsed, sending clouds of dust and billowing smoke into Manhattan as people frantically tried to escape.
The police officer told everybody to form a human chain, and we held on to each other, and he flashed a light, and he directed us to Building 5, and we went out Building 5.
Did you see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. You want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding. People are laying all over the floor. It's horrible. And I was there the first time, and this is twice.
Shortly after the first 2 strikes, another hijacked Boeing passenger plane crash-landed near the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the American military. The building burst into flames and part of its 5-sided structure collapsed. A 4th airliner crashed in Pennsylvania, again after apparently being hijacked. More than 12 hours after the attacks began, the full scale of the loss of life is not known. Nearly 270 people are known to have died in the 4 hijacked aircraft, and union officials in New York say several hundreds of firefighters and policemen disappeared. Many of them are believed dead. The mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, says the total figure will be more than any of us can bear. International leaders around the world have condemned the attacks, among them the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon.
I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil. At this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, completely shocked.
Meanwhile, American forces around the world have been placed on the highest alert and warships have been deployed along the US East Coast. Suspicion has fallen on Islamic militant groups, including those associated with the Saudi exile Osama bin Laden, already wanted by the Americans. The Taliban authorities in Afghanistan, where Mr. bin Laden is based, say he didn't have the capability for such a huge operation. Many world governments have also ordered defense alerts and called emergency security meetings.
Well, after what must have been the worst ever attack on American soil, President Bush has promised to find those responsible for the attacks and to bring them to justice. Bill Hayton looks now at his options.
The wreckage at the Pentagon is still being cleared and the human cost still being counted. America's military headquarters has now suffered the horror inflicted on many army bases and embassies abroad over the past 2 decades. The sheer military might controlled from this building has made direct military attacks against the United States all but impossible. Instead, its enemies have turned to so-called asymmetric warfare, small-scale operations with dramatic effects, such as last year's bomb attack on the USS Cole in Yemen. Washington has responded in 2 ways, by court action against those it believes responsible and also by direct military retaliation.
And I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
When Osama bin Laden's group bombed the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania 3 years ago, killing more than 220 people, the response was dramatic. More than 80 cruise missiles were fired at sites in Afghanistan and Sudan, allegedly connected to his organization. They killed 20 people but missed bin Laden himself. The actual bombers were extradited to the US, and last May 4 men were convicted in New York and sentenced to life in jail. But retaliation doesn't always hit the right targets. In 1986, after 2 American soldiers were blown up in a Berlin nightclub, US planes bombed Libya, though it was later suggested that Syrian agents had been responsible. And Washington is being sued for millions of dollars by a businessman whose Sudanese factory was destroyed by a cruise missile after it was wrongly linked to bin Laden.
If they reflect on these questions and if they look at the source of the resentment in the Arab world and Muslim world, I believe there wouldn't be any attack. But sending cruise missile, it wouldn't solve the problem. It will maybe fuel more problems to the American and to the whole international community.
The USS Enterprise is sailing to join another carrier group in the Gulf, projecting American power into the heart of the Middle East. But political leaders must now decide whether using that power makes further attacks more or less likely in the future. Bill Hayton, BBC News.
Well, here with us in the studio is Dr. Martin Navius, who's a defence and security analyst. Obviously, there was a big, big hole in America's security net.
Yes, the Americans have suffered a major blow, but President Bush came on and addressed the nation in a calm and cool speech in which the subliminal message was that he was still in charge, and the explicit message was that American institutions and values continue. He also stressed that American retribution will be soon to follow. The question is, how far will America go in tracking down the specific terrorists that were involved in this operation and widening their assault onto a broader range of terrorists located throughout the Middle East and the world.
And will American retribution, is there any guarantee that American retribution will be directed at the right target?
Well, the Americans will have difficulty finding definitive evidence linking Osama bin Laden, if that is their main target, to the terrorist assault. But what we are seeing indications of this evening is that Americans are more interested in a broader assault on international terror. That is, going after the causes and supporters of the terror movement. This will be a long and drawn-out and bloody struggle in which there will be many casualties. It won't take place immediately, but it will take place over the next few months and years.
People will be asking in the United States, though, how on earth this could have happened. How could you have a situation where 4 aircraft are hijacked in such a short space of time?
Well, no doubt the planning of this operation took many months, if not years. It reflects a sophisticated terrorist group that is well versed in these kind of operations. This wasn't planned overnight. It took a long time to produce. Now, obviously, the Americans are going to have to investigate the intelligence networks, which were found wanting in this regard. They are going to have to look at their security networks that surround their domestic air flights, and they're also going to look at their whole security network, both military and political, as it is deployed across the world, specifically in relation to terrorism and specifically in relation to terrorist groups in the Middle East.
Americans have prided themselves in the past on the fact that it is so easy to travel within the United States. It's one of the main cogs of their machine, if you like. That is all going to change.
That's all going to change, but even more significant than travel and the ease of travel is the general perception, the worldview, the Weltanschauung of the American population, which will shift dramatically. There will be a greater pessimism, a greater sensitivity to terrorism, and a greater willingness, I believe, to go after terrorists and to take a much more unilateralist approach towards various groups in the Middle East and elsewhere who threaten American interests.
Dr. Martin Navius, thank you very much. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Jonathan Clark, a research fellow in foreign policy studies at the Cato Research Institute in Washington, an expert on American foreign policy, and Anjem Choudary, leader of the British political party Al-Muhajirun, which attracts young British Muslims with its own brand of radical ideas. Mr. Choudary says although everyone's deeply sorry for the victims and their families, it's no surprise that the United States has become a target.
We regret the loss of any innocent lives. Whether we be Muslims or Christians, this is something which is unacceptable. Those people who are not involved in war, who are not perpetrating any violence anywhere in the world, they do not deserve to be targeted. However, we can get an indication of the feeling of the Muslims worldwide by the fact that if you go to Baghdad or you go to Jerusalem today, you'll find that people are celebrating in the streets. That will indicate to you that there is a feeling of retribution or revenge against American atrocities being committed at the present time in the Middle East.
American atrocities?
American atrocities being committed. For example, their continued support of the tyrant state of Israel, the continuing bombing of Iraq, the unilateral bombing indeed a few years ago of Sudan and Afghanistan. We have a long list of atrocities which America have committed, which are enough for the Muslims and the Islamic movements worldwide to consider that they are in fact in a state of war with the American government.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, it seems this has come about because it's payback time for America's foreign policy.
Yes, that may be the case, but I think one of the things that does stand out today has been the number of messages flowing in from the Arab world, from all over the Arab world, and from Mr. Arafat himself, deploring this incident, condemning this as an outrage, and really dismissing any participation in this by the Palestinians. So I think that's an encouraging sign.
Anjem Choudary with us here in the studio. This is just a surely solitary act by a group of extremely radical fanatics who have no real base of support anywhere in the world.
I don't think that's the case at all. I think that the
well, you just heard, hang on a second, Mr. Jonathan Clark just pointed to the number of messages of condolence that have come in from Middle Eastern nations.
But the Middle Eastern nations are run by tyrant regimes, and they have dictators who have nothing at all to say about Islam, and they don't base their policies upon the divine text. Those people who represent the views of the Muslims and Islam worldwide are those legitimate scholars, and fatwa have been issued, for example, by the Sharia courts of the UK today, that American military personnel and buildings and war machinery remains and has been, up until today, a legitimate target because of atrocities which they have been committing.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, do you think this appalling attack is going in any way to change America's policy towards the Middle East?
Well, I think what is going on right now is a period of rational and calm reassessment. The United States policy in the Middle East has been very consistent for over a large number of administrations. I very much doubt that it's going to change in the face of this outrage. But clearly what you are going to be seeing is inside the American government a reconsideration of American foreign policy around the world. But I don't think you're going to see dramatic changes, especially not in the face of this type of provocation.
Anjem Choudary, it's not going to change anything. Thousands of people will have died for nothing.
I think that whoever was behind the actions which took place today are not really the focus point for us. I think what we need to do is we need to look to why people are targeting American interests. Why have people taken the stance that we need to attack the Pentagon, we need to attack the political and the economic and the strategic locations, and really inflict damage upon the American government. And I think it's got something to do with the fact that America continues to have their forces in the Middle East. America continues to back tyrant regimes. And I think that this should be a lesson not only for the American regime, but also to the Muslims worldwide, to say that we need to have a different type of relationship, a relationship based on debate and discussion.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, is America going to learn the sort of lesson Mr. Choudary wants it to?
I think he's rather exaggerating the present relations between the United States and the Arab world. Generally speaking, these are very good. If you think about relations with countries like the Gulf Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, with Kuwait, I think with Egypt, you see a very great sign of friendship and solidarity with those nations. There are obviously major disagreements over Israel, but I think that overall the relationships with the Arab world are good, and they're not going to change as a result of this. So I wouldn't take this out of perspective in terms of American foreign policy. I really wouldn't. I think that this is going to continue in the way that American foreign policy towards the Middle East has been set for a great number of administrations.
Jonathan Clark and Anjem Choudary talking to us earlier. Deborah.